Before we begin, this video acts as a companion to my amateur documentary Who Actually Created Dungeons & Dragons as a brief overlook about the history of other editions of the game. So, if you want to know more about the history and creation of the first couple of editions of D&D, please watch that video first. Now onto the video. It has been half a century since Dungeons & Dragons was created. And for its 50th anniversary year, Wizards of the Coast has created a 5.5 edition and not a 6th edition. This has people somewhat confused about these half editions and getting curious about just how many games there actually are. And the confusion only gets worse when they realize that there are far more than just 5 editions of Dungeons & Dragons. In the beginning, before Dungeons & Dragons, there was Gary Gygax's Chainmail in 1971, a small-scale wargame, and it's written in Fantasy Supplement. The roots of D&D are firmly in wargaming, which started out as a way to do military simulation and study, and continues to be used to this day. But after the Second World War, wargaming had grown to be very popular as a form of entertainment and continues to see success today. Chainmail took these massive battles and put the players in charge of individuals and squads. That combined with the fantasy supplement in Chainmail started to get people's gears turning. A couple of years later, in 1974, Gary Gygax releases the first role-playing game through his new company, Tactical Studies Rules, for the sole purpose to publish Dungeons & Dragons. Everything we associate with RPGs and D&D today originates from this game. Today we call this by a couple of names: Original D&D, or OD&D, White Box, due to the white cardboard box that it started being released in its second printing, and Zero Edition. But why call this Zero Edition instead of First Edition, when it is the first game? Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or AD&D. Gary Gygax didn't feel like OD&D was a finished game, and that it hadn't reached its true potential. So 3 years later, we got 2 games to address this. Yes, 2. You see, AD&D took years to be fully released due to certain limitations of the time, so while it began its release in 1977, the game that you could actually play that year was Basic Dungeons & Dragons, edited by Eric Holmes. Basic D&D isn't completely its own game though. It served as a bridge between OD&D and AD&D, and it was created out of cut material from AD&D. Its only purpose was to introduce new players to D&D so they could eventually migrate over to the main game. Basic D&D is so, well, basic that it only goes up to level 3, while AD&D technically doesn't have a level cap at all. The two big thens AD&D is remembered for today is that it wears D&D's wargaming roots on its sleeves, and that it's not written in English. Veterans often recommend reading the Dungeon Master's Guide as it gives a lot of really good advice and insight on what RPGs are about, but do also warn that it can be a difficult read. The reason for this is that these books are written in what is affectionately called High Gygaxian. You see, Gary Gygax had a habit of reading a bunch of dictionaries and loved flowery language. Very fitting for a fantasy RPG, and it's a huge part of the charm of AD&D. Before you had tons of high-quality artwork all over the book, you had very fantastical language that kicked your imagination into overdrive. But it can be a bit of an odd read to someone used to more modern rulebooks that are written out more like car manuals. 4 years later, a completely new basic D&D was created as a replacement for the glorified AD&D tutorial. This new one, however, is actually its own game, not just a way to get people into AD&D. This is Tom Moldway's Basic, an alternative to AD&D, as AD&D can be quite daunting for some players, especially younger ones. But Tom Moldway's Basic wasn't alone. It got its second half, the Expert Set, from Zeb Cook. Together, these books made the system that is today referred to as Basic Expert, or BX, a very simple and rules-light alternative to AD&D. BX isn't just for a younger audience, however. Its goal was to make a game that was significantly more straightforward and focused than AD&D. While AD&D could be used for almost any kind of a game you can think of, BX focuses entirely on the adventuring part of D&D, which makes it a very popular rule set even today. BX has proven itself to be such a well-designed rule set that has aged remarkably well that to this day there are debates about which is better, BX or its successor. Two years after the release of BX, a new game was released to replace it, Begme. But why replace an already well-made and functional game with a new one? Well, while the 1977 Basic D&D edited by Eric Holmes was nothing more than a glorified tutorial for AD&D, the 1981 Basic and Expert created by Tom Baldwin and Zeb Cook is a half revision and half a new game. Because of this, it still had many connections to AD&D, which apparently made for a lot of confusion and was even intimidating to some, as BX was still connected to this wide web that was AD&D. So TSR made a decision that a new game was to be created that didn't directly use any AD&D material, be it game mechanics or settings. This was an attempt to permanently separate the advanced and basic games from one another, to both expand their audience and to make working on new game material for them much easier, as they no longer had to consider how to make them completely compatible with each other. And the job to make this happen was given to Frank Mentzer, a rising star at TSR and newest promotion to a creative director. And this is how one of the single most influential editions of Dungeons & Dragons ever created was born. All the way from kickstarting the new general visual look of the era with the most famous piece of Dungeons & Dragons artwork ever created, Larry Elmore's Red Dragon, to having one of the most popular settings of the Golden Age, Mystara. Despite it taking a few years to actually develop, the Hollow Planet with 2 moons is home to some of the most popular adventure modules for D&D as a whole. It also incorporates into itself the legendary Kingdom of Blackmoor. In the Golden Era, this was the most translated edition of D&D worldwide, and is directly tied to the events and creations that I will have to talk about another day. Begme was created as a true alternative to D&D, a full game that covered every aspect of Dungeons and Dragons in a much more simplified and straightforward manner. It proved to be extremely successful, outright competing with AD&D as a whole. BX simply doesn't compare to the scale and scope of Begme. But why do I keep calling it that? Well, Begme isn't a single book, it's a collection of 5. Basic, Expert, Companion, Master, and Immortal. Combined together, these make Begme. The reason for this separation is because each of the books focus on different aspects of Dungeons and Dragons. In the Red Basic book, you play through levels 1 through 3, and it focuses on the most famous aspect of D&D adventuring, the dungeon crawling. The Blue Expert book focuses on levels 4 through 14, and is focused on the adventures outside the dungeon, traveling the world, surviving in the wilderness, and getting hirelings and building your own domain. In the Green Companion book, those domains expand into dominions, towns, cities, and even kingdoms. Players will also be able to command armies and engage in mass combat in fairly high-level play through levels 15 to 25. Inside the Black Master book, players expand mass combat into actual warfare, with sieges and expanded logistics. Players also now have more options with the new Weapon Masteries rules in engaging in battle themselves with very powerful enemies. The Master book is set for players levels 26 through 36. At this point, players will also discover something rather controversial in D&D. They discover a path to immortality, which brings us to the Beige White Book of Immortals, where players can become gods and commit deicide. BECMI is simple, scalable, and a completely full game that can be easily modified to your table's needs. But it is also the last edition of Dungeons and Dragons from the Golden Age. This was a dark time for Dungeons and Dragons, and is the result for why the second edition of Advanced D&D is the way it is. The creation of second edition is largely shrouded by controversy, not just because it came out 12 years after AD&D, but because of the very reason it exists in the first place. Let's go back to 1983, to the release of BECMI. Gary Gygax began work on collecting notes for a full revision of AD&D, a sequel, a second edition. About 2 years later, Gary Gygax releases something quite interesting. Unearthed Arcana is sometimes retroactively referred to as AD&D 1.5 because it revises AD&D and adds in a lot of new rules, both completely new ones and revised material from the Dragon magazine. The big reason why it's sometimes called 1.5, however, is because it largely acted as a preview and experimentation of some concepts for Gary Gygax's second edition. The big thing that Gary Gygax was going to do with second edition was pushing the genre forward, both metaphorically and literally. Not only did he want to completely rework the game mechanics from scratch, but he wanted to push D&D from the medieval era onto the Renaissance. But two problems kept delaying these plans. 1. Gary Gygax was busy with everything but game design. 2. He had realized his own strengths and weaknesses as a game designer and a writer. The big thing that famously kept Gary Gygax busy, apart from the brand in general exploding in popularity, was the D&D movie that Gary Gygax spent years in Hollywood trying to make into reality. While the movie project never went anywhere, Gary Gygax was able to land a deal for the 1983 Dungeons and Dragons cartoon that ran for 2 years with 3 seasons with a total of 61 episodes. But sadly, its finale was never finished due to the show's cancellation. The other thing was Gary Gygax realizing that he simply wasn't up for editing work anymore. Unearthed Arcana had taken 2 years to make, and the general layout and formatting of RPGs had changed and improved dramatically. Gary Gygax's strengths were in game design and game directing, not in editing. And with the huge plans he had for second edition, he realized he needed to get help. And he found the perfect man to potentially take over him under his supervision. A game designer who was on the same wavelength about RPGs and D&D as Gary Gygax himself was, Frank Mentzer, the creator of BECMI. After the partnership was forged, Gary Gygax decided to officially announce second edition to the world in issue 103 of the Dragon magazine in November of 1985, going as far as teasing the fans with new classes he was making for it. But by the time the November issue had even been printed, Gary Gygax was gone from TSR, alone with his second edition. You see, behind the scenes, the Blooms family had been taking over TSR for years now, going against the company's creator on everything, and trying to maximize profits while simultaneously wasting money so fast you'd think they were lighting up their cigars with $100 bills. The Blooms were so bad with wasting money that they actually bought a helicopter because they wanted to, without realizing that you need to have a helipad built for it, and also without realizing that helicopters need helicopter pilots, which they had to hire on retainer. And if you don't know what that means, imagine having a heart attack in your wallet. And in the end of 1985, the Blooms had managed to become major shareholders and had kicked out Gary Gygax from the very company he created. TSR and D&D had been stolen from their creator. Now that the Blooms were in full control of TSR, they started to make some changes. You see, the Blooms were for the most part purely business suits and not gamers. And this was 1985. What is so significant about that year? Satan! The Satanic Panic. While it began in the 1970s and didn't end until the 1990s, it was most prevalent in the 1980s. The satanic panic had affected Dungeons and Dragons just as it had affected things like heavy metal, skyrocketing their sales. Dungeons and Dragons was accused of everything from tricking children into joining a satanic cult to being the blame of degeneracy of the era. And just like with movies, music, and video games, it didn't matter that the actual subject matter was literally about fighting against the devil and the forces of hell. Just because it had a demon on the cover, it must mean that it's about Satan worship. While in reality, you play as heroes who can be priests, clerics, and paladins, and literally wield the power of God against demons. But no! D&D goes to suicide, assassination, insanity, sex, perversion, homosexuality. Anyway, despite the satanic panic only succeeding in creating a Streisand effect, skyrocketing sales of D&D every single time a new controversy came up, the new TSR was terrified. TSR was afraid that if even a single big horrific crime was committed to or by a child, that the entirety of TSR was in danger. Not just D&D, but every other product they make. So TSR began work on a big rebranding campaign. While this started before 2nd edition, it is exactly what 2nd edition itself is mostly negatively remembered for. A completely corporate, sanitized, and castrated version of D&D to appease people who never wanted to have anything to do with D&D or RPGs in general in the first place. But instead of doing this in the name of extremist politics and pure hatred of anything and everything that makes RPGs and D&D what they are, TSR wanted to rebrand to appear family-friendly and garner a wider audience out of pure fear for their wallet. There was just one big problem: how to make 2nd edition. Without Gary Gygax, TSR had complete control on what to do with D&D, but they weren't expecting that a bunch of people left with Gary Gygax, including most of the remaining veteran game designers that TSR hadn't gotten rid of yet for siding with Gary Gygax, including the man who was supposed to take over Gary Gygax as the creator of 2nd edition, Frank Mentzer. This made the TSR collectively go f***, but after calming down, they went through all the remaining game designers they had, and to the shock of everyone, the 3rd game designer ever hired at TSR was still there. Editor of famous adventure modules, such as the Keep on the Borderlands, writer of settings such as the Kara Tour of the beloved Oriental Adventures, designer of famous adventure modules such as The Isle of Dread, Vecna Lives, and the creator of the expert half of the 1981 BX edition, Zeb Cook. Just one problem: TSR. Zeb Cook wasn't really allowed to do anything with 2nd edition. He simply did what he was told to do. So, what makes 2nd edition stand out from the other editions as a game? Nothing. Seriously, nothing. Not even TACO, or to hit armor class 0, which was an in-house tool for AD&D to create adventure modules with. It was leaked late in AD&D's life, and 2nd edition simply collected it. And that's ultimately what 2nd edition became, a collection. What it ended up being was nothing more than a revision of AD&D with tons of more optional rules, with the actual list of changes being a gigantic list of minor changes that pile up to be a small mountain. It's sanitized and corporate, but as a game, it's just revised AD&D. Better in a lot of ways, and it was even revised by Zeb Cook in 1995 with the, well, revised edition, which is referred to as 2.5, even though it's mostly just errata and not an actual revision. But what 2nd edition is positively most remembered for is easily its supplementary material, especially its settings. Spelljammer took our fantasy adventures to the stars with weird sci-fi. Dark Sun combined the desert post-apocalypse of Judge Dredd and Mad Max with dark fantasy and twisted sword and sorcery. Ravenloft. The legendary adventure module turned into a full campaign setting, a kingdom frozen in time for the simple entertainment of the dark powers. But arguably, the most impactful one was created by the author of 2nd edition himself, Zeb Cook. Hailed as one of the most unique and interesting D&D settings, without going into a too wild of a direction like with Spelljammer and Dark Sun, the home of madness, the world between worlds, the keeper of infinity, where the city of doors lies, where thou shalt not fuck with the Lady of Pain, where sigil can be found, the setting of Planescape. Even if you aren't familiar with Planescape itself, you are likely familiar with events that were created in it, such as the Celestial Aasimar and the Demonic Tieflings. And yes, Planescape is the very setting that was used for the video game Planescape Torment by Black Isle Studios. Yes, it's actually a Dungeons & Dragons game. And no, Zeb Cook didn't have anything to do with Planescape Torment. He did, however, work with Black Isle Studios as a game designer on Fallout 2. With a new advanced D&D edition, there also needs to be a new basic D&D edition. And 2 years later, in 1991, we got one. The confusingly titled Dungeons and Dragons Rules Cyclopedia. But why is it called that? Well, it's not as dumb as it first seems. Remember how 2nd edition is just a collection and revision of AD&D? Well, TSR ordered another veteran game designer, Aaron Alston, to do the same, who is mostly known for his work on supplementary material for 2nd edition and creating the 5th edition of the superhero RPG Champions. Non-RPG fans might also know him for writing about a dozen Star Wars books. He was given the job to revise and repackage the entirety of Beckme into a singular book. Almost. The Immortals set is missing. Kind of. It was fully remade into its own book, the first supplementary book for the Rules Cyclopedia, The Wrath of the Immortals. And to this day, this complete collection and revision of Beckme is the only core rulebook ever released for D&D, a singular gamebook instead of 3. And this is also the last game, not counting 2.5, that was released before TSR went bankrupt and was bought out by them. Because TSR kept spending money they didn't have, their big marketing relaunch was a failure. And in 1997, Wizards of the Coast bought TSR, gaining the Dungeons & Dragons IP for themselves. They immediately began work on a role-playing game engine, not just for D&D, but a system that could be used in many different products. This became the D20 system. Oversimplified, the D20 system made the D20 to be the only dice that mattered. 3 years later, in 2000, the 3rd edition was released, and it was completely broken. Without going too deep into detail, 3rd edition was broken on every level. Game design, balance, contradictions, etc., to the point that Wizards of the Coast immediately began work on a fix. Only problem is that the fixed version proved to be such a gigantic list of changes that they ended up making a whole new game that took 3 years to make. And in 2003, we got 3.5. The reason for this is that Wizards of the Coast got too ambitious trying to make the most complex and rules-intensive edition yet, which resulted in a game that they collectively spent 6 years just trying to fix, and never really succeeded. Gary Gygax himself would comment on the whole debacle a year after 3.5 came out, in a 2004 GameSpy interview. Have you had a chance to play or even look at some of the current Dungeons & Dragons games? I've looked at them, yes, but I'm not really a fan. The new D&D is too rules intensive. It's relegated the Dungeon Master to being an entertainer rather than the master of the game. It's done away with archetypes, focused on nothing but combat and character power, lost the group cooperative aspect, bastardized the class-based system, and resembles a comic book superheroes game more than a fantasy RPG where a player can play any alignment desired, not just lawful good. Now, should I tell you what I really think? Only if he knew just how accurate this would become a decade later. Wizards of the Coast simply didn't understand how RPGs or how D&D works, and still don't. Part of that lack of understanding is them dropping the advanced title from the game. They still kept the advanced edition numbering though because of marketing and because they simply don't care. It also meant that this new edition, which was the most complex and rules intensive yet, didn't have any kind of basic edition counterpart to it. Sure, the old rules cyclopedia exists, but it wasn't in print. Wizards of the Coast actively refused to reprint or sell digital copies of the old editions of D&D for almost 2 decades after getting the IP. It's why retro clones became a thing after Wizards of the Coast made the Open Games License, or OGL, which allowed people to use any edition of D&D to make their own products, as long as they didn't use copyrighted material such as Beholders, which was both the best and the worst thing that Wizards of the Coast did, as the OGL opened the floodgates for literally anybody to use these various rule sets to make their own thing, opening the floodgates for cheap cash grabs. But it also birthed the homebrewing community. Homebrewing has always been a thing, but the OGL allowed people to legally use these rules to make their own products, which exploded homebrewing on a level never seen before. This is where Pathfinder comes from, originally starting out as something like 3.7, as it's just 3.5, but even more expanded, complicated, and broken, with its main attraction being homebrewing. It also exploded in popularity after Wizards of the Coast released their next edition, which was 4th edition. It's it's not a bad game, it's just... Let me try to paint a picture in your mind. Typically in RPG combat, you roll for initiative, meaning your turn order, then you roll to hit. Then you add in your modifiers from your weapons, your attributes, spells, skills, or any other situational effect. Then you roll for damage and do that again. In 4th edition, you do video game level math to do almost anything, all on pencil and paper. Let me use a visual aid. This is Fallout. And this math problem is what the computer is doing to determine if you hit the target or not. Not the damage, just the hit chance. And every one of those bits of text are math equations within math equations. A similarly very complicated math equation is also made to calculate damage. Now, imagine doing this kind of math manually with pencil and paper for 3 to 20 different characters for every single round of combat. Remember how I mentioned how 3rd edition was the most complicated version of D&D yet? Well, with 4th edition, not only did they want to make something even more insanely complicated, but it's not an RPG. Not really. It has all the things you find in RPGs, but that is very much not the point of view of the game design. Don't be mistaken, this is a miniatures dungeon crawler war game with RPG slapped on the side because of the name Dungeons and Dragons. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. This is what a reasonable person would have sold as something like Dungeons and Dragons Tactics, a wargame spin-off, instead of a whole new edition. But why does this exist? The answer is both very simple and very, very dumb. You see, 3rd edition came out in 2000, 3.5 in 2003. In 2004... World of Warcraft came out. The first big World of Warcraft clone came out 2 years later, in 2006, by the title of Dungeons and Dragons Online. Is it obvious yet? MMOs had been exploding in popularity for years at this point. Ultima Online, EverQuest, Star Wars Galaxies, etc, etc. But World of Warcraft was such a big hit that kept on growing and growing that it changed everything. For even more additional context for just how fast the genre itself was growing, RuneScape 2 hit its peak player base in 2007, and the same year, the Lord of the Rings Online came out, and in 2008, 4th edition came out. And as Wizards of the Coast was continuing its path of outright intentionally refusing to understand how and why Dungeons & Dragons worked, they tried to be modern, hip, trendy, and catch the video game audience with their new edition. And it failed hard. Not even the OGL could save 4th edition. No one was interested in this, and no one wanted it. Ironically, the edition specifically made as an adaptation of video games was never used for any video games, despite it being most fit for one. 2 years later, in 2010, Wizards of the Coast tried to relaunch it not as 4th edition, but as D&D Essentials, sometimes referred to as 4.5. But no one cared at that point anymore. The biggest disappointment to me personally is the very comic book art style of 4th edition. It is my absolute favorite of the Wizards of the Coast edition's art styles, and it's tied up to a complete failure. Then there is 5th edition in 2014, and 5.5 in 2024, or as they call them, D&D Next and 1D&D, don't ask. A bad game by bad people for bad people. Moving on. But let's end the video on a much more positive note, shall we? Remember how I mentioned back in the 2nd edition section that Gary Gygax actually was working on his own 2nd edition? Well, while that never came into fruition, there is a game that he did work on as a consultant and as a creator of supplementary material. A game that he claimed was very similar in many ways to his own idea of a 2nd edition, and very similar to one of his own homebrew games that he ran that combined OD&D and AD&D that he affectionately referred to as OAD&D. A game that bears a name that is a very deep-cut reference to the very origins of D&D and the people who helped create role-playing games in 2004's Castles and Crusades. They'd even made tribute covers to the original AD&D covers and the Red Dragon of the 1983 Basic using the original sketch as its main inspiration. And it is straight up my absolute favorite RPG book cover ever. It captures the essence of RPGs perfectly. The game itself is a modernized, rules-light RPG with an old-school design perspective from true fans of Dungeons and Dragons at Thrall Lord Games. It's easy to modify to your needs and has an insane amount of high-quality supplemental material. This is the true successor to Dungeons and Dragons, and the very last game that Gary Gygax worked on, as he sadly passed away in 2008, 34 years after the release of Dungeons and Dragons. At the age of 69, barely 3 months away from reaching 70. And in a completely unprecedented move, Troll Games made the ultimate act of tribute and decided that Castles and Crusades was never to be changed. The game books do have new printings with new artwork, formatting, errata, etc., but the game itself has never been changed. Troll Games is to this day the only company who was ever involved with Gary Gygax that rightfully respects the man who created Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games as a whole. And those are the many editions of Dungeons and Dragons. And as you can see, there are far more than just 5.